Black boss pretends to be customer to test employees. What happens next will shock you. It was a late Thursday morning at Edenbridge & Co., an upscale retail chain renowned for its sophisticated ambiance, exclusive designer collections, and impeccable customer service. On the surface, the spacious aisles and polished displays reflected nothing but elegance. Sales associates, each dressed in crisp, fashionable attire, bustled between racks of luxury handbags and suits. Customers admired sleek evening gowns, carefully examining fabric details under the gentle glow of strategically placed spotlights. Everything seemed perfectly in place. But beneath that polished veneer lay a darker truth. Whispers had circulated for months. Brief mentions of discriminatory behavior toward black customers, rumors of condescending attitudes, and outright racism that only emerged at the edges of the store's pristine facade. Most employees seemed unaware, or perhaps they chose not to see it. Even those who suspected something was amiss kept quiet, fearful of jeopardizing their careers. After all, Edenbridge & Co. was a big name in the fashion world, a place where rising stars in retail hoped to build lucrative futures. Yet, for Alexander Mills, the 45-year-old black CEO and founder of the entire Edenbridge chain, these rumors could not be ignored. He had poured his heart and life savings into building this empire from the ground up. Renowned for his brilliant business acumen and unwavering leadership, Alexander prided himself most on his commitment to fairness. Over the past few months, however, he'd received a growing number of complaints about certain locations, especially the flagship store in the city center. Sporadic yet eerily similar reports described how black customers were treated poorly or even followed around as though they were suspects rather than patrons. Alexander knew he couldn't rely on second-hand accounts alone. Aware that if he walked in as himself, employees would scramble to display their best behavior, he devised a plan that only a handful of trusted confidants were privy to. He wanted to witness the truth firsthand and tackle the problem from its roots. No more hearsay. He needed undeniable proof. One humid afternoon, about 85 degrees Fahrenheit outside, Alexander met with a professional makeup artist he'd hired specifically for this covert operation. The transformation was painstaking. He was already a tall man with a lean build, but the artist used advanced prosthetics to subtly alter his facial structure. A carefully chosen wig concealed his usual professional haircut, and a special foundation deepened his skin tone just enough that he became unrecognizable even to close acquaintances. He wore casual clothes, simple jeans, and a loose hoodie, nothing like the tailored suits he typically sported. When he finally stood before a mirror, he felt an odd dissonance. He hardly recognized himself. Before heading to the store, Alexander rehearsed his role in the privacy of his car, parked a few blocks away. He planned to enter as a relaxed shopper, someone who might be browsing for an outfit rather than seeking the latest exclusive designer release. The objective was straightforward but crucial: see if the rumors of racist behavior held any truth. The moment he stepped through the massive glass doors of Edenbridge's flagship location, nobody smiled or rushed to greet him. Usually, as CEO, Alexander would be welcomed by every manager and associate in sight. Now, disguised as an everyday customer, he was met with little more than a cursory glance. He walked past glittering displays of new season shoes, noticing how a petite sales associate named Mia West, 26, shot him a fleeting look of annoyance. Mia quickly turned away, pretending to busy herself with a rack of dresses. Alexander exhaled slowly, his heart pounding with equal parts anticipation and disappointment. He knew employees here were trained to greet customers with a warm smile, offering personalized assistance. Yet no one approached. He examined a sleek leather jacket that caught his eye on a nearby rack, casually lifting the price tag. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered employee named James Reed, 30, sauntered over with an air of impatience, practically rolling his eyes. "What do you need?" James asked, his tone flat. His posture screamed reluctance, as though he'd been forced to deal with a nuisance instead of a customer. Alexander pointed at the jacket. "I'm curious if you carry it in a large." James barely looked at the tag before replying, "That's an expensive line. You sure you can afford it? Why don't you check out the sales section instead?" He nodded toward a separate area of the store, a clear attempt to redirect Alexander away from the pricier items. Alexander felt a knot tighten in his chest. It wasn't merely the words, it was the dismissiveness in James's eyes. The immediate assumption that he couldn't possibly belong among these luxury products. He thanked James tersely and moved on, determined to see how the rest of the staff behaved. In the next 20 minutes, Alexander interacted with several more employees, each encounter leaving him more unsettled. One sales associate seemed to sigh audibly before acknowledging his question about the fit of a suit jacket. Another spoke to him in clipped, condescending tones, as though explaining something to a child. When he finally selected an item to purchase and approached the register, Mia handled his money at arm's length, making obvious efforts to avoid touching him. Her eyes darted around, almost as if she hoped a manager would intervene and hasten his departure. Not one employee recognized him, not even as a loyal customer, let alone the company's CEO. And not a single person showed him the courtesy or warmth that Edenbridge & Co. prided itself on. By the time Alexander stepped back out onto the bustling city sidewalk, he was seething. He'd suspected racism might be lurking, but the sheer consistency of negative treatment was more pervasive than he could have imagined. That night, he returned home, scrubbing off the makeup and prosthetics in front of his bathroom mirror. The process took nearly an hour. With each passing minute, the weight of what he had experienced settled like a stone in his chest. It was one thing to suspect bigotry existed among his staff, it was another to be confronted with it so blatantly. He barely slept, already planning the store meeting he would call the following morning. At 8 a.m. sharp the next day, Alexander arrived at Edenbridge & Co. in a sharp navy blue suit, polished leather shoes, and his usual poised demeanor. The difference in reception was instantaneous. Store managers and senior sales associates hurried to greet him, exclaiming his name and offering firm handshakes. Mia stood at the front, wearing an overly bright smile. James lingered near the register, stiff with the awareness that the boss was in the building. It was the polar opposite of how they'd treated him only 24 hours earlier. He summoned every employee, about 20 people including part-time staff, into the back conference area. They crowded in, chatting in hushed tones, wondering why the CEO had shown up unannounced. Once everyone was seated, Alexander cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, scanning the circle of faces. "I have something very important to discuss. Yesterday, I visited this store undercover. I disguised myself so you wouldn't recognize me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. A low murmur spread through the group. James shifted uncomfortably, and Mia blinked rapidly, her smile evaporating. Others just stared, a mixture of confusion and unease etched on their features. "What I witnessed was worse than I feared," Alexander continued, his voice echoing in the cramped space. "I experienced racist treatment from several of you. I was dismissed, belittled, and essentially pushed out of the store. And let me be perfectly clear, I'm not just disappointed, I'm angry." A heavy silence settled over the room. Some employees avoided his gaze, suddenly interested in the texture of the carpeting. "This behavior goes against everything Edenbridge & Co. stands for and everything I stand for," Alexander said. "And it stops now. Effective immediately, we will be instituting changes. We will not discriminate against any customer. We will treat everyone who walks through those doors with respect." He heard a few employees shuffle nervously, but no one dared interrupt. Alexander was known to be fair but resolute when his moral code was violated. "However," he added, "words alone won't fix this. I want you all to truly understand the damage you've done. So starting tomorrow, each of you will undergo a similar transformation. You will be disguised as black customers. Then, we'll visit different stores and establishments, and you'll see firsthand what it feels like to be treated the way you treated me." Gasps and stunned expressions filled the room. The idea was unprecedented and frightening. No one spoke. Alexander's jaw was set in firm determination, leaving no space for protest. The following day, one by one, employees arrived at a designated makeup studio a few miles from the store. Professional artists used specialized makeup, wigs, and prosthetics to alter skin tone and facial features. Some employees recognized each other only by voice. The transformations were jarring. People who had always navigated life free of certain prejudices found themselves walking in drastically different shoes. Alexander, still reeling from his own experience, led them to various retail stores, coffee shops, and even a convenience store or two. It didn't take long for the employees to encounter exactly what Alexander had experienced at Edenbridge & Co. In one downtown boutique, a manager barely acknowledged them and seemed ready to call security the moment they asked about trying on shoes. In a nearby coffee shop, they were directed to wait far longer than other customers, clearly being served last even though they'd arrived first. James, who had outwardly scoffed at black customers in the past, found himself receiving suspicious glares from a store clerk who followed him through the aisles. At a local diner, Mia was told there was no seating available, only to watch a group of white customers be seated mere seconds later. By the end of the day, faces were etched with shock, embarrassment, and emotional exhaustion. The trip back to Edenbridge & Co. took only about 3 miles, but it felt interminable. Everyone was silent, reflecting on how it felt to be on the receiving end of such blatant prejudice. During a debrief in the store's conference room, Alexander looked at the worn expressions on each face. "Now you know," he said softly, his own voice tinged with sadness. "This is what you've been dishing out, this sense of rejection, that feeling of being singled out and judged before you've even spoken. The anger, the shame, it doesn't just go away." James swallowed hard, guilt knitting his brow. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Mills. I never thought it felt like that." Mia rubbed her eyes, trying to hold back tears. "It's not enough to say you're sorry," Alexander replied, a note of compassion in his tone. "Although it's a start. The next step is to change. Really change. And I'm going to help you do that." In the days that followed, Alexander rolled out an intense training regimen for the store. Every morning, employees gathered an hour before opening to participate in workshops on racial bias, empathy, and proper customer engagement. Outside professionals were brought in, including counselors and civil rights advocates, to lead open dialogues about discrimination. They didn't mince words. It was uncomfortable, it was eye-opening, and it was entirely necessary. James began keeping a journal of his personal experiences and reflections, jotting down every moment he caught himself making snap judgments. Mia, who had once prided herself on being friendly to everyone, realized she'd harbored subconscious biases she never questioned. Many employees openly shared stories of their own upbringing, acknowledging how stereotypes had seeped into their thinking. Slowly but surely, Edenbridge & Co. transformed from the inside out. The store introduced a more rigorous code of conduct, strictly zero tolerance for any form of discrimination. Employees who failed to comply would face immediate consequences. Management also revised their hiring procedures, emphasizing diversity and thorough background checks on prospective hires' attitudes and past behaviors. However, Alexander's resolve didn't stop at his own store. He had always believed that real change extended beyond a single location. In collaboration with local community leaders, he set up a weekly initiative. Each Monday evening, after the store closed, employees would join volunteer groups to assess other businesses rumored to practice discrimination. They worked closely with city officials and advocacy organizations, documenting their findings and proposing actionable improvements. At first, many business owners were defensive. Some flatly denied any wrongdoing. Others claimed they were too busy to schedule a meeting. But Alexander and his newly enlightened team approached each conversation with patience and empathy, emphasizing that their goal was not to condemn, but to initiate positive change. Often, they shared personal stories, how they'd unknowingly perpetuated harmful stereotypes and what it felt like to be on the receiving end. This authentic, vulnerable approach began to crack the walls of denial. Within a few months, they saw tangible results. Several restaurants removed discriminatory seating policies and began training their staff to welcome all patrons. Fashion boutiques revisited their customer service guidelines, ensuring that security protocols did not unfairly target Black customers. A few businesses even requested Edenbridge employees demonstrate the makeup transformation so their own teams could experience life from a different perspective. By the end of that year, local papers picked up the story. Word spread far beyond the city, reaching neighboring regions. People were fascinated by the idea of a CEO disguising himself to unearth racism within his own ranks. Soon, journalists reached out to cover the weekly volunteer visits, turning the Edenbridge initiative into a significant conversation starter nationwide. More importantly, the city's attitude started to shift. Community groups and local youth organizations began hosting seminars on racial equity. Churches, synagogues, and mosques invited Edenbridge team members to speak, bridging faith communities in a shared effort to combat discrimination. A local university's sociology department even created a case study based on the Edenbridge model, inviting Alexander and his team to guest lecture. Their approach, personal transformation leading to collective action, offered a blueprint for other businesses that struggled with similar issues. Even James, once one of the biggest culprits, found a new sense of purpose. On weekends, he volunteered at a local after-school program, mentoring Black teenagers who dreamed of entering the fashion industry. Mia became an outspoken advocate for inclusive marketing, pushing for campaigns that featured more diverse models and collaborated with minority-owned brands. 2 years later, as he walked the polished floors of the flagship store, Alexander paused by a display of winter coats. His eyes flicked to a new hire, a 22-year-old sales associate named Raven, who was politely helping a Black customer navigate the newest arrivals. Raven smiled warmly, offering various styles and making friendly conversation. Alexander felt a swell of pride. The difference in employee attitudes was palpable. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, a request from a boutique in a neighboring state asking for help with anti-discrimination training. Alexander allowed himself a small smile. The mission was far from over, but they'd come so far since that fateful day he first walked into his own store. Unrecognized and humiliated. That evening, he convened a short meeting, praising the staff for their hard work while reminding them there was still more to do. The team, once filled with defensiveness and apathy, listened with genuine attentiveness. "As we move forward," Alexander said, "remember that changing attitudes is a lifelong commitment. What started in this store has spread to our community, and it can keep spreading if we remain consistent. We're not looking to shame others, we're looking to educate and inspire." James nodded, recalling his own transformation, the guilt he had carried, and the empathy he'd gained. Mia, no longer the hesitant cashier, raised her hand and suggested they partner with more local businesses to share what they'd learned. Alexander encouraged everyone to continue forging alliances, not just in the city but beyond, reaching into other states. Years passed. Edenbridge & Co. expanded to new locations across the country, each store upheld to the same rigorous standards of inclusivity and respect. The volunteer outreach program evolved into a fully staffed department dedicated to consulting with other companies. Articles were written, interviews were conducted, and national news segments featured Alexander's transformative journey. He was invited to speak at business conferences and diversity forums, always emphasizing that the first step toward ending discrimination is to face it head-on, even if that means shining a light on one's own flaws. By the time Alexander was 50, the brand he created was about more than high-end fashion. It had become synonymous with positive change and social responsibility. In many ways, that mattered more to him than the million-dollar deals he'd brokered along the way. Yes, the fight against racism and prejudice would continue. There would always be challenges, always new biases to uncover and dismantle. But Edenbridge & Co. had proven that transformation was possible, that empathy could be taught, and that even the most deep-seated biases could be uprooted when confronted with honesty and courage. On a brisk autumn evening, Alexander looked out the window of his office on the 15th floor, watching the city lights shimmer in the distance. His mind drifted back to that day he'd walked into Edenbridge & Co., disguised and anxious. He remembered the sting of prejudice in James's dismissive words, the cold avoidance in Mia's eyes. He remembered the anger and sadness he'd felt, realizing his life's work had become tainted by the very injustice he sought to battle. But mostly, he remembered the unshakable conviction that something had to be done, and the undeniable truth that change had to start from within. That conviction had led to transformation, not just in the store's culture, but in the hearts of its people. And in turn, they'd taken that change far beyond the store's walls, sowing seeds of empathy in places where discrimination had once thrived. As he closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, Alexander Mills allowed himself a moment of gratitude. It had been a long, painful road, filled with uncomfortable truths and difficult conversations. But if there was one lesson he wanted the world to learn from Edenbridge & Co.'s journey, it was this. Real change demands courage. Courage to look in the mirror, courage to confront what's wrong, and courage to guide others toward doing better. And with that courage, a single step taken in the right direction could ripple out miles beyond what anyone ever expected, opening the door for a new generation to continue building a more equitable world. And so, Edenbridge & Co. moved forward. One lesson, one conversation, and one transformed attitude at a time, proving that even the most elegant facades can become beacons of genuine progress when the people behind them resolve to make a difference for everyone.